Hi, this is the course about validation, and in this module we will dive deeper into the Fluent Validation Library. We will discuss how to implement conditional validation, set up cascade validation modes, override error messages, and how to integrate the library into the ASP.NET pipeline. We will start off with conditional validation. To demonstrate this feature, let's say that our API also needs to accept the student phone number during registration. And this phone number needs to be not empty, and it also needs to follow a certain pattern. It should consist of 10 digits, the first of which cannot be 0 or 1. I'm checking that pattern using the must method that we already used in the previous module. This method accepts a generic predicate, a method that returns a Boolean value. This method is going to do a call to the regex class to check the pattern, putting this on separate lines, and I'm also adding a custom error message because the default one in the must method is rather generic. Let's run the application and see how this validation works. I'm adding a phone field to the request with some Washington DC region phone number. Running it, and you can see that the request worked. And if I add an invalid character to the number, then the validator successfully catches this error. Now, the problem arises when I try to send a null instead of the string. Here you can see the Fluent Validation Library has thrown an exception because it tried to pass a null into this method call. It is essentially the same issue that we had in the previous module when we tried to validate the collection size. The problem here is that although we do check for the phone number non-emptiness, these two checks run independently of each other. And so even though the first check fails, the Fluent Validation Library still tries to run the second check to gather all issues with this field. This is where conditional validation comes into play. Using this when method, we can ask Fluent Validation to run the predicate check only when the phone number is not empty. Let's run the application again and try to send the same request. And you can see that the application doesn't throw exceptions anymore. But it stopped checking for nulls either and registered the student with the empty phone number. Why is that? The issue with our implementation is that this condition applies to all preceding checks and not just the must method call. To fix this, we need to indicate that this condition is only applicable to the current validator, which we can do using this enum value. By default, this method uses the all validators value, which means the condition is applied to all previous validators. Let's run the application and send the request. And now the check is working. The validator has successfully caught the empty phone number. And the check for the incorrect phone number works too. Very good. Thankfully, we don't need to resort to the when condition if we just want to run a regular expression check against the input string. We can do that using the built-in matches method that will take care of everything, including checking the input string for null. This one line replaces these three lines, which I'll comment for now. I'll remove them later. There is a more complex use case for conditional validation, and that is when a property check depends on another property. To demonstrate this scenario, let's say that the student must provide at least one contact method, either the phone number or an email address. They can also provide both, but one of the two should be enough to register the student. How can we implement this new requirement? The first thing that comes to mind is to use the when method that we used earlier. In other words, do something like this. Only validate the email property when the phone number is null, and only validate the phone number when the email is null. But that doesn't work, and let me show you why. If I put null in place of email, and also put an incorrect phone number, then the validation works correctly. It says that the phone number is incorrect. But if I put an incorrect phone number while there is an email, then the validation doesn't catch the issue. You can see that the API has successfully created the student. That's because we asked Fluent Validation to only check the phone number if the email address is null. Alright, so this implementation clearly doesn't work. There is another option. Fluent Validation also provides the top-level when method that works like this. We need to provide the condition, which in our case is that email is not null. And then if the condition is true, Fluent Validation will invoke the rules that we list in this delegate. In our case, the email property checks. We can also ask it to do another set of checks if the condition is false. For that, we need to call this otherwise method. I'm passing the phone number checks here. And of course, we don't need these last when method calls. While this implementation looks promising, it doesn't work either. It would work if we had the requirement to provide exactly one method of contact, either email or phone number. If that was the case, we would just need to state that the phone number must be null if the email address is not null, and vice versa. But because the student can still provide both a phone number and an email address, this implementation is not good either. So what should we do then? We must do the check in two steps. The first step is to check that if the email address is null, then the phone number must be present. And the other way around too. If the phone number is null, then the email must not be empty. The second step is to do the complete validation of the two fields, but only if these fields are not null. This way, we are requiring at least one of the two fields to be present, but at the same time allow the client to provide both of them. Let's run the application and make sure it's working as expected. If I specify an invalid phone number, then the API returns an error. Same for the invalid email address. And finally, if I set both of these fields to null, then the API asks us to provide at least one contact. Very good. In the previous demo, we had a deeper look into the feature of conditional validation in the Fluent Validation library. We used the two versions of the when method. The first one is used within the rule chain. By default, the condition in the when method call is applied to all checks that precede that method call. If you only want to apply it to the immediate previous check, then you need to pass this argument. In this particular example, the input string will be validated against the email regular expression only if that string is not null. But the other two checks will be invoked even if the email is null. The second version of the when method is designed to group multiple property checks under one condition. Here, for example, we verify that if the email is null, then the phone number should not be empty. And also, if the phone number is empty, then the email address should not be null. Notice that these particular two checks could be implemented using the first version of the when method, like this. But I personally don't like when the same rule chain refers to more than one property, and prefer to use the more verbose yet more explicit syntax. Another similar feature is the cascade mode. It controls how Fluent Validation invokes rules within the same rule chain and between different rule chains. Let's see it in practice. To demonstrate this feature, let's comment this code for now, and let's say that for some reason we want to check the phone number using the must method instead of the matches method. As you might remember, we had an issue with this approach previously. The Fluent Validation library invoked both of these checks regardless of whether one of them failed. So even if the phone number is null and the first check doesn't pass, the library would still invoke this predicate. This behavior led to a null argument exception because the regex class doesn't allow input strings to be null. Last time we fixed this issue by using the when method that told Fluent Validation to only invoke the must method if the phone number is not null. But there is another way to fix this. We can also set the cascade mode on the whole rule chain such that if one of the rules fails, the library doesn't go further. Here you can see the two cascade modes available in Fluent Validation. The continue mode is used by default and means that the execution continues when the rule fails. To change this behavior, we need to use the stop method. Let's run the application and see how it works now. Changing the phone number to null, and you can see that the library successfully caught this error. And it also didn't invoke the must method, because if it did, the application would throw an exception. And the regular expression check works too. Very good. Alright, this is the cascade mode when it comes to rules inside the same chain. We can also set the cascade mode between the rule chains. By default, Fluent Validation invokes all rule chains to get and display the maximum number of errors. Let me actually show you that. Let's put a breakpoint here. If I remove both the phone number and the student name and look into the errors produced by the library, you can see that it lists both of these errors here, the empty name and the empty phone number. This is controlled by the same setting, but this time at the class level. Let me comment this line. Here it is. It's the same setting as in the individual rule chains, but it affects the cascade mode both inside the rule chains and between the rule chains in the same class. If I run the application and send these two null values again, you can see that Fluent Validation is now only showing the first error about the name property. Notice that this class level setting also affects the cascade mode inside rule chains, so specifying the stop cascade mode here is unnecessary. Finally, in addition to the class level cascade mode, we can also set it up globally. This is how it looks. This setting is equivalent to setting the cascade mode at the class level in all of our validators.